I teach English at Barnard College, and I've been for the last couple of years preoccupied with the Palestinian question, trying to understand the Palestinian question, the roots and causes of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and the relationship of the US and Israel. That's how I came to the question. I'm originally from the area, so helping me understand some of the things that I've experienced living there.
You've just finished this program, this lecture by Noam Chomsky that was delivered in 1989, a long time ago, over 15 years ago. What do you think were the key points that people can learn from this lecture, looking back 15 years, that Chomsky talks about that are relevant to understanding the conflict today?
Well, I thought it was a very important lecture, still very relevant to understanding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Arab-Israeli conflict for that matter, and more broadly the US role in the region. Two main things that come to mind that I always felt were generally Chomsky territory, as it were, in trying to understand international relations of the Middle East. One very important dimension of the argument has always been for him to try to understand the main cause of why the US is in the region. Why the US came into the region, why the US has been involved in the region since 1940. And I think this has always been his emphasis, that the US is there to control oil. Not to control oil because it needs it, but to control oil because it, using that, tries to determine the policies and the accumulation strategies of its allies, Japan and Europe. So that has been there and constant since the 1940s. Out of this primary, initial, foundational US cause for US presence in the region comes out hostility to nationalist regimes. And from that period, from 40s, 50s onwards, when the older, greater powers evacuate the conflict, the area, the US moves more in and gets more and more hold of the region. A very important indicator is the 1956 war, where, and in relationship to the behavior of the Israelis, it's a very important indicator if we compare it with the 1967 war. In 1956, Israel attacked Egypt in coordination with England, the UK, and France. And Eisenhower's response was very clear and very important, and he said Israelis should evacuate Sinai. And of course, Ben Gurion started shouting about Al-Arish being Jewish land and all of that, and Eisenhower was very firm. He said Israel has to leave Sinai. Israel left Sinai and left Gaza as well. Exactly because Israel attacked without either prior US knowledge or without US consideration in order to serve other US allies in the region. The 1967 war was done with US coordination and with a green light from the US, exactly in order to serve US interests in the region. So it was much more in alliance with the US then. Much more in coordination with the US then, cemented later on the US-Israel alliance. Now, it's important in relationship to oil because that 67 war, very importantly, ended up crushing Arab nationalism politically. So out of the oil concerns comes a hostility towards the US, and into that is inserted the Israeli role. Israeli role, I think, foundationally, very important, is premised on what Chomsky says, very importantly, the strategic asset thesis, that Israel has played since 1967 a strategic role in US regional policy. And the most crucial part of it is not in protecting oil. I don't think that's what Israel is there for. I think the US in and of itself can do that on its own much more important than US directly. First Iraq war is an example of that. The second Iraq war, the 2003 war, is an example of that, where the US doesn't actually need Israel to actively protect or go in and control the oil itself. What the US needs Israel for is to try to crush Arab nationalism, to try to push back any kind of Arab radicalism or any kind of move to independent political regimes, popular political regimes. So to keep the Arabs ruled by, maintain authoritarian elite rulership over the Arabs, which was very, very amenable for US primacy in the region. Saudi Arabia is a very favorite regime for the US. The Egyptian regime, after Sadat's peace treaty, becomes a very important regime in that sense. The Jordanian regime has always been important. One thing you can say about this, which Chomsky has always emphasized, is that the Egyptian case is a very interesting case in its changing response to the US in the region. After the 1967 war, something very interesting happens in Egypt. Egypt recognizes that for it to return the Sinai region and for it to return its national rights violated by Israel in the 1967 war, it has to not pursue its Soviet alliance, but actually move towards the US. And there are peace overtures by Sadat, very importantly, from the early 1971 onwards. Endless overtures, endless interviews saying that if we don't return our lands by peace with Israel, we are interested in peace, we're happy to settle the conflict based on land for peace formula, we're happy to settle with the Israelis. The Israelis, of course, refused that. If we don't get that by the peace route, we will do it by force. And that's what happened in 1971 onwards, and by 1973, Egypt initiated the war in order to return Sinai in coordination with Syria. Syria wanted to return the Golan Heights. It is then that the US awakens and realizes that Egypt is a very important strategic. It takes a war for Kissinger to recognize how significant and how really ruffled and angry Egypt was about the Israeli occupation of Sinai. So Egypt can force the US by the power of war to change its policy over Sinai. So the US comes in after the 1973 war and tries to settle the Egyptian-Israeli conflict very specifically. And Sadat comes in to effectively say that if Israel if Israel returns Sinai, we will have peace with the Israelis. And that way, recognizing that he could only get Sinai back not through the Soviets but through the Americans. The other interesting issue about the Egyptians, and there's an interesting comparison with the Palestinians over this issue, is that because Egypt is such a powerful state, Egypt could actively do it by force. Right? It could attack Israel. It could try to get back its national rights by force. For the Palestinians, because they're so weak, because they don't have the capacity that the Egyptian state has, they couldn't force themselves onto the attention of the Americans for them to sufficiently put pressure on Israel to settle the conflict. The problem of capacity or lack of capacity for the Palestinians has been one of their major problems in the region. That's why Egypt can return its rights and the Palestinians couldn't.
Were there some other key issues that you saw coming up in this early lecture that you think are relevant to the discussion of the issue today?
The lecture was given in 1989. This was the time when the Palestinians were in active, spontaneous and popular revolt against the Israeli occupation. And it brings us back to that very important moment, I think, when the Palestinians were closest to ever trying to achieve national self-determination. What comes out of this moment, mass, again, spontaneous, what Chomsky calls actually a revolutionary mobilization by the Palestinians to overcome their subjugation by the Israelis since 1967. What comes out of this is a formalization, a consolidation of Palestinian peace initiative.